In the winter of 1941, in the city of Leningrad, a mother divided a single piece of bread the size of a matchbox into 3 pieces and gave 1 piece to each of her children and ate nothing herself. The bread was not bread in any meaningful sense. It was a mixture of sawdust and cellulose and flour dust and whatever else the bakeries could find to stretch the supply. The children ate their pieces and asked for more. There was no more. Outside the window, the temperature was minus 30 degrees. The city had no heat. The city had no electricity. The city had almost no food. The Germans had surrounded it on all sides and were waiting for it to die. And in Moscow, Joseph Stalin had made the calculations and decided that Leningrad would not be surrendered and would not be fully supplied and would not be evacuated. The city would hold. The people would hold. And if the people died in sufficient numbers to hold the city, then that was the price of holding it. 800,000 people died. Some historians say the number was closer to 1.5 million. Most of them starved. And when the men who had saved the city came home from the war, Stalin had them shot. To understand what Stalin did to Leningrad, you need to understand what Leningrad meant. Leningrad was not just a city. It was the second city of the Soviet Union. It was the city of the revolution, the city where the Bolsheviks had seized power in 1917, the city that bore Lenin's name, the city with the largest concentration of industry and culture and educated population in the Soviet Union outside Moscow. It was also a city with its own identity, its own pride, its own sense of itself as something separate from, and in some ways, superior to Moscow. That sense of independent identity was something Stalin had always watched with suspicion. A city that thought of itself as special was a city that might think of itself as deserving something different from what Stalin provided. In peacetime, that suspicion had been managed. In wartime, it became something more dangerous. The German Army Group North reached the outskirts of Leningrad in September 1941. The speed of the German advance had been catastrophic. The Soviet military collapse in the first weeks of Barbarossa had been so complete that armies had been encircled and destroyed before anyone in Moscow fully understood what was happening. By early September, the Germans had cut the last land road into Leningrad. The city was surrounded. 2.5 million civilians were trapped inside with whatever food had been stockpiled before the ring closed. The stockpiles were not enough. Everyone who did the calculations in September 1941 understood that if the siege lasted through the winter, the food would run out and people would begin to die. Stalin faced a choice. The choice was not as simple as surrender or fight. There were options between those extremes. The city could be evacuated. The civilian population could be moved out before the siege tightened completely. In the summer and early autumn of 1941, there were still routes out of the city. The evacuation was partial. Some children were sent out. Some factory workers and their equipment were moved. But the full evacuation of 2.5 million people was never ordered. The reasons were multiple. The logistics were genuinely difficult. The transport was needed for military purposes. But there was another reason that the people who studied the decision closely have identified. Stalin did not want to evacuate Leningrad because an evacuated city was a city that might fall, and a city that fell was a propaganda disaster that Stalin could not afford in the autumn of 1941 when the Soviet Union was losing the war on every front. The civilians in Leningrad were not just people. They were the garrison. Their presence in the city was itself a military and political fact. Their willingness to die rather than let the city fall was the message that Stalin needed the world to receive. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was when the dying was worst. The German siege had cut all land routes. The only connection between Leningrad and the rest of the Soviet Union was across Lake Ladoga. In summer, boats crossed the lake. In winter, when the ice was thick enough, trucks drove across it. The route was called the Road of Life. It was also the road of death for the drivers who crossed it when the ice was too thin, and for the civilians who were evacuated across it in temperatures that killed the weakest before they reached the other side. The food that came in across the lake was never enough. In November 1941, the daily bread ration for civilians was reduced to 125 grams. 125 grams is about the weight of a small apple. That was all, for a day. For a person doing physical work in temperatures that required enormous caloric expenditure just to survive. People began dying in November. By December, they were dying in the streets. By January, the bodies were stacked outside apartment buildings because the survivors were too weak to carry them to the burial sites. People ate anything: leather belts, wallpaper paste, cats, dogs, rats. There are documented cases of cannibalism. The Leningrad NKVD records from that winter contain hundreds of cases of people arrested for eating human flesh. These were not monsters. These were people who had watched their children die and had lost the capacity to be anything other than an organism trying to survive. Stalin knew what was happening. The reports reached him. The death figures reached him. The food supply calculations reached him. He understood that the city was consuming itself. He made decisions about supply levels and evacuation priorities that affected how many people died. Some of those decisions can be explained by the genuine constraints of a country fighting for its life on multiple fronts simultaneously. Some of them cannot. There are documented instances where food shipments that could have gone to Leningrad were directed elsewhere, where evacuation priorities were set in ways that kept workers in the city who might have been saved, where the calculations that Stalin made included the civilians of Leningrad as a variable that could be adjusted rather than as human beings whose lives had an absolute claim on the resources of the state. Stalin did not deliberately starve Leningrad, but he did not do everything possible to prevent the starvation, and the difference between those two things cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The siege was finally broken in January 1943, when Soviet forces opened a narrow land corridor to the city. The full liberation of Leningrad came on the 27th of January, 1944. 872 days after the siege began. The people of Leningrad came out into the streets and wept. They had survived something that should have killed them all. The men who had led the city through the siege were celebrated as heroes. Andrei Zhdanov, who had been the party chief of Leningrad during the siege. Alexei Kuznetsov, who had organized the defense. Voznesensky, who had managed the wartime economy. These men had kept the city alive. The Soviet people knew their names. The Leningrad survivors revered them. And Stalin looked at the men who had saved Leningrad and began planning how to destroy them. The reason was the same reason Stalin had destroyed Zhukov and Poskrebyshev and Tukhachevsky before them: popularity. The leaders of Leningrad had survived something extraordinary, and the Soviet people knew it. They had a bond with the city and with the people of the city that existed independently of Stalin. They had authority that came from what they had actually done rather than from what Stalin had granted them. And in Stalin's Soviet Union, authority that did not come from Stalin was by definition a threat to Stalin. The men who had saved Leningrad were more dangerous to Stalin than the men who had simply served him. Because the men who had saved Leningrad had something Stalin could never take away from them: the gratitude of the people they had saved. The Leningrad affair began in 1949. The charges were the standard charges: factionalism, anti-party activity, promoting Leningrad's interests above the interests of the Soviet state, creating an independent power base. The real charge was surviving the siege and being celebrated for it. Voznesensky was arrested in March 1949. Kuznetsov was arrested in August 1949. Others followed. The investigation consumed the entire leadership structure that had emerged from the siege. More than 2,000 people were arrested. In September 1950, Voznesensky and Kuznetsov and 4 other senior Leningrad officials were tried and shot. Dozens more were sent to the camps. The city that had survived the Germans was now being systematically stripped of the people who had saved it. The particular cruelty of the Leningrad affair was its timing. These men had spent the war years doing something genuinely heroic. They had kept a city alive through conditions that were almost incompatible with survival. They had made impossible decisions under impossible circumstances, and they had made enough of the right ones that 800,000 people who might have died had lived. And then they had come home from the war and spent 4 years in peacetime service and been shot for the crime of having done all of that too visibly. The siege of Leningrad had lasted 872 days. The Leningrad affair lasted less than 2 years. It took Hitler almost 3 years to fail to destroy Leningrad. It took Stalin less than 2 years to destroy the people who had saved it. Leningrad was renamed St. Petersburg in 1991. The siege is remembered there with an intensity that has no parallel in any other city in the world. The Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery contains the mass graves of 500,000 people who died during the siege. Every year, on the 27th of January, the city stops and remembers. The bread ration of 125 grams is displayed in the Museum of the Siege. The people of St. Petersburg know what was done to their city, and they know what was done to the people who saved it. The Germans tried to destroy Leningrad with tanks and artillery and starvation. They failed. Stalin tried to erase what Leningrad had done and the people who had done it. He almost succeeded, but the city remembered. Cities that survive what Leningrad survived do not forget. They do not forgive, and they do not let the dead be erased.